My guest is Raymond Ibrahim. He is the author of Defenders of the West, the Christian Heroes Who Stood Against Islam. Raymond, thanks for joining me today.
Good to be with you, Charles. Thanks for having me.
You know, this is really an exciting book as somebody who likes to read history. It's a military book. It talks about these enormously heroic and valiant figures, people who defended Christendom against the oncoming Islamic onslaught starting in the 8th century and really going all the way up to the siege of Vienna, which was in the 16th century. And you cover 6 personalities. I'm about a third of the way through the book. I'm reading it very carefully. I know that one of those personalities is Vlad, known as Vlad the Impaler, which I thought was interesting. But these are very exciting figures of courage and enormous skill in war in terms of holding off the onslaught. But before we go to that, I want to just talk a little bit of background in terms of what had happened when the military forces of the Prophet Muhammad emerged out of Arabia and basically conquered and subdued nations that had been Christian nations for many, many centuries, including Egypt and North Africa, Iraq, and eventually what we now know as Turkey. So this is the background. So give us some background about the situation on the ground, as it were, before the launching of the Crusades.
Sure, Charles, like you indicate, and I'm glad you bring this up because oftentimes when we talk about Muslim-Christian interaction, violence, warfare, and so forth, it begins with the Crusades. And that's unfortunate because that's, in other words, it begins in a vacuum. And people are given the false impression that somehow the Crusaders initiated hostilities, etc. But as you say, really the hostilities begin 4 centuries earlier, before the Crusades, with essentially the Prophet Muhammad. And, this is all written and codified in the Quran and the Hadith, which is Muhammad's recorded words and sayings and deeds and actions, and as well as early Islamic history and the Sirah and so forth, which all together tell you that, as you said, all of North Africa and the Middle East, from most of Iraq or Mesopotamia, really, that area, and Syria, greater Syria, which encompassed modern day nations of Israel and Jordan and Lebanon and so forth, all the way to the west, Egypt and Libya and Tunisia and Carthage at the time, and Algeria and Morocco, to give them their modern names. All these, of course, were more Christian than most of Europe at the time in the 7th century. And again, most people don't realize that because those countries are presented often, as Islamic today. And so the idea is they've always been Islamic. Well, they haven't. They actually were fiercely Christian. And you look at a map, essentially in that 1st century after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD, 1 century later to 732 AD is, of course, the pivotal Battle of Tours in France. And that just gives you an indication of how far the Muslims went from Arabia, their homeland, all the way to France in 1 century. All those areas were conquered in between, including, of course, Spain and portions of southwest France for a long time, even after the Battle of Tours. Even the Muslims actually got into Switzerland in the 8th century, and they sacked Rome in the 9th century. All these are little known things. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that even though if you read about this from secondary histories and scholars and academics, they may be pretty honest about what I'm saying, but what they often don't mention or bring up or tie to is the fact that these were seen as Islamic jihads. These were seen as Muslims following the imperative set forth in the Quran to conquer so-called infidels and bring Islam to them and so forth, which is another way of saying that if you think of what so-called radical Muslims today, let's say the Islamic State, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and these groups, the things that they say and do, which we're habitually told, have nothing to do with Islam. They've hijacked Islam. This isn't the true face of Islam. In fact, that's exactly how those all those early jihadists spoke. And it wasn't a bunch of ragtag terrorists who had no backing. It was the caliphs, it was the sultans, it was the emirs, it was the top leading men who actually spoke this way. So the things that you see, beheading blasphemers, exacting what's called jizya or tribute from them and making them live as second-class citizens, destroying churches, not allowing them to be built, enslaving women and children, and all that. That just litters all of early history of Islam vis-a-vis the West and European nations. So that was going on. This is a brief encapsulation, but to really fast forward it to the Crusades. Right before the Crusades, then Asia Minor, what we today call Turkey, really one of the oldest Christian regions there ever was. It's where St. Paul sent his epistles to all those regions and cities. That was now being attacked by the latest standard bearers of the jihad, which were the Turks at this time. The Arabs had waned in power and influence, and now the Turks were essentially this jihadist war machine who, according to scholars such as Bernard Lewis, really were, really perfected the art of jihad more than even the Arabs before them. And they were now terrorizing Anatolia, Asia Minor, and literally in the years before the Crusades, the sources speak of hundreds of thousands of Christians, Armenians, Greeks being slaughtered, being enslaved, thousands of churches being burned, women and children, enslaved and all that. And that's actually how the Crusades begin. And Emperor Alexius, Byzantine or Eastern Roman Emperor, was calling for help and aid. And then, the year 1095, Pope Urban, Council of Clermont, and the rest is history.
So and yet in today's culture, we are generally taught the Islamic version of the Crusades, that somehow they were colonialists, that they were the ones who were attacking, when in fact, not only were they liberating ancient Christian lands, which were still had Christians that were being persecuted in them, but they even were trying to simply clear the way for Christian pilgrims to peaceably visit Jerusalem and the holy sites, which they had been banned from by the Muslim powers, and that people who did visit them were being slaughtered and being abused. And so, in a sense, it was Christian Europe, Christendom, that after centuries of losing ground and being attacked, began to reassert itself and stand up to this ongoing onslaught. Really, as you point out, it started with El Cid in Spain, who pushed back on the Almoravids, who were the ISIS of their day. And then the Crusades under Godfrey really going into Asia Minor and eventually setting up the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And that these were basically reassertion of rights and powers in ancient Christian lands. But Raymond, you're getting into something that's more fundamental here, and it's something that was discussed by Harvard professor Huntington in his Bloody Borders theory, the clash of civilizations, and that is that the Muslim is not a radical in a sense, as they're called now, but in fact they're fulfilling much of the language in the second part of the Quran and much of the career of Muhammad himself, who was actually a military general who, called for the conquest of the entire planet. He wanted a one world government under the scimitar as a reflection of the one God in heaven, and that everyone would have to submit to this rule.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. I think one of the other aspects of the book, what it shows you, is sort of what I indicated earlier, that today we're taught that whenever a Muslim or a Muslim group engages in terrorism, intolerance, whatever the case may be, or a mob in Pakistan burns some Christian alive because he was perceived as insulting Muhammad, or it even happened recently in Nigeria to a young girl, Deborah Emanuel, a college student, and burned her alive. That sort of thing, we are always pressured and told that's not true Islam, that's not true Islam. But if you look at the book, like I said, that is what Muslims did, starting with Muhammad. And I mean, the whole idea of the word, when you hear of Sunnis and Shias, Sunnis amount for about 90% of all Muslims around the world. They're the vast majority. The word Sunni comes from the word sunnah, which means to follow the example of. Okay, so whose example? Muhammad's. So anything that Muhammad says or is written in the Quran or is an example, and we have copious volumes of things that Muhammad said and did, you're supposed to do. So all of these things, Muhammad had people go assassinate an elderly Jewish man because he mocked him, Muhammad. And he had a young Muslim go pretend to be his friend, the Jewish poet's friend, until he took him into his confidences. And then once the time was right, he beheaded him, brought his head back to Muhammad, and they all screamed Allahu Akbar. Allah is greater. So the point is, one of the strengths, I think, or one of the reasons really I wanted to write this book is to show you that this stuff really has been going on. It's not something that just happened because of ISIS who hijacked it. But the only difference, I suppose, and again, as this history shows, is that Europeans and Christians tried to actually reassert themselves against it after a while, because like I said, it took the Muslims really juggernauted all throughout the Christian world for centuries. And finally you get the Crusades, which is as others have called it, it's a belated 4th century rebuttal to the jihad. It's just unfortunate how it's presented today in a vacuum, and we're told that this is what started. You have actual serious analysts who will tell you, and I remember this from the days of Al-Qaeda and after 2001, that they're angry because of the Crusades, and that's one of their grievances, which is all nonsense, and they never even talk about it. I mean, they don't like the Crusades, but they completely understood it and understood the logic. It wasn't something because they actually did, they were more aggressive themselves. So it's just unfortunate the way everything's become topsy-turvy. And part of the reason I wrote this book is to offer something of a corrective.
Indeed, and I think that to expand the thesis, Samuel Huntington notes with Bloody Borders that Islam is pushing up against any nation, Christian and otherwise, India, the Philippines. We could look at parts of Indonesia, wherever there's a large Muslim population. They are pushing up and they're engaging in jihad against the non-Muslim population, or they're engaging in a more subversive form where they go into a country. And you show this in the chapter about El Cid, how they were working that. Where they would be, like in Valencia, they were quiet, they were observant, because they're waiting for a time when they can reach a level of power that they could then show their true colors. And that in that sense, they were allowed to be deceptive. Works similar to communism in a way, like the idea of subversion until you have the right conditions to take over a country. And I think, but having said that, we should note that there have been and there are many Muslim societies that are not engaging in jihad. The only difference I would note in that regard is that they are exceptional, that that's not really what Islam teaches. And it's a converse to Christianity, which generally teaches a personal relationship between a believer and God through Jesus. But yet Christianity also has essentially done jihads. But that's, in a sense, the diversion. It's not the mainstream. It's not really the actual doctrine and the teaching of the New Testament. It's something that, gets into more basic elements of human nature where people can, sometimes in power, are tempted to engage in war.
Yeah, and I'll take it to Spain, and you were mentioning the Cid, of course, because I think that really complements, excuse me, what you were talking about. And first, let me just say, again, you talk about the Crusades, and that's what most people associate when they hear of violence or conflict between Christians and Muslims historically. But no one really remembers Spain, and that's on the other end of the Mediterranean, on the far west coast. And that, again, of course, Muslims invaded it in the year 711, and they actually stayed there until, you still had pockets of Muslims until about 1600. Right. So you're talking almost 1,000 years. Now, when the Muslims actually took Spain, they conquered almost all of it except the northwest quadrant, the mountainous, desolate region where so many Christians were holed up in the mountains. And that's where the Reconquista begins, which means a reconquest, taking Spain back to Christendom. And that takes centuries. And really, the Cid is one of the more pivotal characters and one of the early ones in it. But I also have another one, St. Ferdinand III, King Ferdinand III. And the point, though, it just shows you that this wasn't some weird aberration going on in the Holy Land because of the Holy Sepulchre and Crusaders wanting it. This was happening all the way on the other end. And it was the same thing. These were considered crusades, and the Muslims were engaged in jihad. And I agree with you, of course, about not all Muslims are committed to jihad and so forth. As you said, too, I also agree that, but that is what is expected. There's so much written about this, that, doctrinal writings from very highly authoritative Muslims that make this very clear, ulama and scholars and sheikhs and so forth. But what's interesting, and here's the other aspect that, this dynamic, I think, comes into play today, and it's recorded in the book. I have it in here, which is basically after the Christians had almost won all of Spain and the Reconquista was complete. Muslims were still subverting and causing problems, mostly in Granada, far south, and so forth. So the Christians just concluded you either convert to Christianity, because it was seen as the only way they could slough off their sort of Islamic tribal hostility. You have to become one of us, basically, or you leave. So a fatwa, which it means, a decree from a authoritative jurist, came out telling the Muslims that they can pretend to convert to Christianity, they can get baptized, they can go to church, they can partake of communion, and so forth. But as long as their heart is still with Islam and that they're ready to go on the offensive whenever the time is opportune, that's okay. They can do that. And so literally 500,000 of Muslims became Christian overnight. And this went on for generations. It wasn't just one group, generations worth. And there's a very telling quote that I always mention of a Christian saying that they were, it was so shocking, they were better Christians than us. But then it turned out that at home they were preaching jihad to their children, they were, doing all this and that. And whenever there was an attempt, or for example, Barbary pirates they would ally with, or the Ottomans they would ally with the Turks, and that's actually what led to their expulsion. So the point is, the point is, Islam, even it's called the doctrine of taqiyya. Islam actually permits deception, and to the point of you can blaspheme against Muhammad if you want, as long as you're doing it for an ulterior purpose, which is to benefit Islam. And I think, we actually, this still continues till this day. That still goes on, and I follow this closely and I write about it. Where Muslims actually did. A story came from Turkey where a group of Muslims converted to Christianity and were going to a pastor's church and would go have dinner with him and his family. And it turned out they were actually doing all that because they were getting information about his church and they were trying to assassinate him. And they did this for years. So this is something else I think to be wary of.
Right, and there are also some organizations that are Muslim in this country. I'm not sure I should name them, but they're the big ones that might have some troubling connections with Muslim Brotherhood and other true Islamic groups, but they pose as like the moderate pro-America type of situation. As far as Spain goes, also I should note that the Jews got caught up in the crossfire of that, and they also went underground. They became a Marano, secret Jews. But the Jews didn't have any designs on conquering Spain and the world, and they also were expelled. Now, the other thing I've noticed, as I said, I'm up to El Cid, and it's an amazing book. I should again mention Defenders of the West. I put a link to it on my site.
Right here.
There you go. It's excellent, and it's really a superb history, and I hope that our viewers here check it out, because it gives a solid counterpoise to today's culture. And these are great men. They really did defend the West. If it wasn't for them, we'd all be speaking Arabic today.
Yeah.
The other element that I've noticed about the Islamic forces, and maybe I'm reading into this, but this seems to be very perverse. They seem to be involved in horrible atrocities and sexual improprieties and all sorts of, subverting, the moral order. It makes me wonder, does Islam have, the same basic moral code that we have in the Western, in Judeo-Christian West?
No, the short answer is no. And if you understand the mechanics of Islamic law and how Sharia is developed and what Muslims are supposed to do and not supposed to do, it's actually ironic. Not many people understand this, but in Arabic, there's a term. It's called usul al-fiqh. And people translate it as it's a reference to about 4 different sources, which include the Quran, the Sunnah, the Hadith, as I was mentioning, and things like the consensus of the community of the Ummah, what they think is right or wrong. Those based on those things, that's how based on those things, Muslim scholars and jurists have actually created a system whereby every single action that you can do on this earth is classified either as permissible or as obligatory or as disliked. You can do it, but you shouldn't, or forbidden. It's on that everything. Okay, so and the word usul al-fiqh, what I meant by that is actually, if you translate it literally, it means epistemology. It means the sources of knowledge. And so what that means is those things, the Quran and the Hadith, become the basis in the Muslim mind of everything, including what is right, what is wrong. And it's all really comes down to a man, Muhammad. Now, if you believe he's a prophet, that's one thing, and he's sent from God. But if you don't, and that's the non-Muslim default position, then what was he? I think C.S. Lewis actually pointed this out about Jesus. He said he's either Lord, liar, or lunatic. And I think you can apply this to everyone, including Muhammad. If he's not a prophet, then you're left with either a liar or a lunatic. Now, when you look at the things that he said and taught, I'll give you another example. He said he said that, okay, and it's hard to even make this succinct, but long story short, he said women who don't know men are strangers. One way to get past having them together in the same room, okay, is the woman breastfeeds the man, and then he becomes her son. Okay. Now, as absurd as this may sound, it actually was issued as a fatwa from the most prestigious Islamic university today, Al Azhar in Egypt, maybe like 10 or 15 years ago, and it caused a scandal and so forth. But it just shows you, how that kind of thinking, because Muhammad said it, it has to be right. So that's why you see what you're seeing, which is, well, Muhammad had sex slaves. Muhammad had married his youngest
child
wife.
brides, right?
Child bride. His youngest wife, Aisha,
Was
at
9 years old. Yeah.
9 years old. He was fondling her and then supposedly married her at 12. So all of this
and honor killings.
Killings.
People talk about rights, individual rights. Women are real property of men. If they go out, if a woman goes out the door that's not in the company of a man, she could be killed.
Yeah. Yeah, apostates. Muhammad said, if you leave your religion, kill them. So when you see them saying kill the apostate because he converted to Christianity or he just left Islam, that traces back to Muhammad. So that becomes the foundation for all Muslims. This is right and wrong. And much of it, I think, is tenacious and acceptable because it traces back to tribal mores. It's just tribalistic thinking. What Muhammad really did, as I've written before, is he's deified tribalism. Okay, so now tribalism, which all human societies have been, partook of throughout the centuries, even though many, of course, have broken away from it, is very natural to people. But what Muhammad did is he made it into a sort of structure that is deified, and the head chief is Allah and himself, of course, because he's the mouthpiece.
He turned it into tribalism, into a word of God. And I also understand, I've heard liberals say that this country's states to attempt to regulate things like abortion, we're turning into the Taliban because of this. But in fact, Islam allows abortion right up to the moment the baby's born.
And see, that's the other thing. A lot of people always, when they think of Islam, they think very ultra conservative and draconian. But some of that is true, but some of it isn't, as in the example of the woman and the breastfeeding business. And so that sort of thing, there's other things that I can tell you which would be considered immoral. But I'm sorry.
It's primitive, frankly. I know that may not be a fashionable word, but in Islam, ultimately, I think is a secular faith in that it does call for the physical military conquest of the entire planet. Everyone has to submit. The word Islam, the word means to submit, and that the world is divided. And this is, my source on this again is Samuel Huntington, between the world of war, the Dar al-Ab, which is the world that refuses to submit, the part, and the Dar es-Salam, which is the part of the world that has submitted. And we're not talking about spiritual submission here. I know some people have said jihad is like a thing that, it's something internal, but no, this is a physical conquest. It is militant in the same way communism is militant. It calls for a world, dictatorship of the proletarians, and except with Islam, it's a world under the scimitar. And we have to understand that we're talking about a conquering, aggressive world order, physical, secular movement here.
Absolutely. I mean, you really said it, and that's the whole point. When we just say, oh, they're all religions. Oh, they're all the Abrahamic religions. Islam is just like Christianity and Judaism and everything else. Well, no, this is, and the thing is, and it comes out repeatedly in the book, pre-modern Christians, for all their, backwardness and inability to be progressive, understood this. They didn't call it Islam. They didn't even call it a religious system. They understood that Muhammad was, as they called him, a bandit. And he created a system where he lied about God that allows men to go rob and plunder and feel good about it. And then it's topped off with them going to heaven and having more carnal pleasures with
Right.
72
The
virgin and
70
all that sort
virgins,
of thing.
yeah.
Right. So for the longest time, nobody thought of it or saw it as a religion. It was actually seen as just really an abomination, if you want to be honest, in the way Europeans wrote about it, and non-Europeans, because as you mentioned, it wasn't just Christians who dealt with the jihad. Actually, I think in India, maybe more Hindus were killed in the name of Islam than anywhere else. Millions were actually butchered
Oh, yeah.
ruthlessly.
I mean, India had one of the worst genocides in history. I mean, the mountains of Afghanistan are called the Hindu Kush, which means the Hindu fields of slaughter.
Yeah.
Millions of people were slaughtered. Those were Hindu countries originally. So here we are today. Over 1 million Muslims I think, are now settled in Germany, France, Britain, elsewhere in Europe, Netherlands. Is this something that we need to be concerned about? Are they going to become loyal, integrated citizens of those countries, or are they going to be ultimately jihadists?
Look, if they're going to be honest and true to the teachings of Islam, it's going to be the latter. And the simple reason is Islam actually, in the Quran, it tells Muslims never to assimilate with non-Muslims. There's a verse that says, do not befriend or take as allies Christians and Jews. It names them.
Right.
And if you do,
yeah.
right, and if you do, you're no longer a Muslim. And there's another verse, 64, Surah and Surah 60 and Ayah 40, which basically says you have to hate non-Muslims, even if they're your father, your son, your wife, until they become Muslim. So there's this divisive doctrine that if you're going to be true to Islam, and I'm talking about the Quran, so forget about even the Hadith, which is tends to be even more radical, but just the Quran, which every Muslim accepts, tells you not to assimilate and to have hostility for the infidel. And when you're able to overcome them, and when you're not, to pretend to be their friend. So that doctrine, of course, and that teaching is going to create problems. Now, put that aside and look at Europe. And if you look at the countries that have a large Muslim population, you're going to see problems and violence. And much like here, often it's not reported. I read a report in France, which has one of the largest Muslim populations, something like 10%. And it says that 2 churches every day are desecrated, and feces thrown at them, and, beheaded statues of Jesus and Mary and so forth. And, one can say, and they try to say it's not Muslim, to say, oh, it's Satanist and so forth. Well, but if you look at the Islamic world, that sort of thing happens very frequently too. So, you got to connect the dots. And then there's these enclaves, there's these enclaves.
The no-go zones, right?
No-go zones all over the place in Europe. And that's, again, goes back to that doctrine where you don't want to get close. So they themselves, Muslims, are happy to come and benefit off of these rich Western European nations. But at the same time, they want to live in their own zone. They don't want to participate or certainly not assimilate, as mentioned. So these are all real things that are happening. And a lot of Europeans are, angry. But as I said, much like here, they don't have much of a voice. It's suppressed. You think nothing's going on. I remember in Britain where some Muslim man, I think from Africa, just with a cleaver, butchered a man somewhere in the middle of the street. That thing's becoming even more common. Not necessarily that exact thing, but just the violence. There's the mass rapes and grooming of girls that happen in
Britain.
So it's there's certainly a problem. For me, I can trace it to the doctrines and the history, so it makes sense. It's part of a continuum. But for others, even if you don't want to look at that, there is a problem. You look at the countries that have large Muslim populations, you have crime. The Eastern European nations that don't, they even, they use this and throw in the face of the European Union and say, we don't want Muslims in our nations because we don't want to be crime ridden like you. Sweden went from, since it's opened its doors to mass migration, mostly from Muslims and Somalis and so forth, it's become the rape capital of the world. But if you go back before then, in the 80s and so forth, it was probably one of the least crimes, rapes, and so forth. But they won't. But in the news, they try so hard to conceal the identity of the culprit.
Well, I wonder why that is. But I think that we should also note that that all cultures are not the same, and all religions are not the same, and that there are some that are superior to others. I'm not saying that out of a sense of chauvinism. I don't think America is better than anyone else. But for various reasons, we embrace certain principles that made our civilization more productive, safer, more dynamic, more organic, more oriented toward freedom, more individual, more based on individual rights, more individual identity, whereas the Muslim cultures don't do that for people. You know, they're very oppressive, and they don't foster innovation. They don't foster, you know, the development of a middle class or private property. They're very corrupt. And I think that, you know them by their fruits. This is what it looks like if you go to every Islamic dominated country versus Western countries. Those are just facts. So my question to you, Raymond, is why then are we letting this happen in the West? I mean, why are we putting everything that we've invested, going back to the days of Sid and going back to the days of Godfrey with the wars that they conducted to save Europe? Why are we doing this to ourselves now?
Well, there's so many different angles and approaches to this question, but I'll look at it, from one angle, one lens, which is basically what you're discussing is a sort of, it's all these maladies and philosophical maladies really that have been subverting the West. And you can call them things like relativism, postmodernism, loss of faith, materialism. All of these things have fused. Marxism really symbolizes all of this. All of these things have fused in a way that has impacted the Western mentality and how it understands the world. And so now, I completely agree with you when you say not all cultures are equal, because what is a culture? A culture is essentially based on the beliefs of a people, their priorities, their sense of right and wrong. Okay. Well, we just saw certain things in Islam. Killing the person who wants to leave Islam is okay. He's an apostate. Killing the person who speaks against Muhammad is not just okay. It's obligatory. Having 4 wives, having concubines, all of this is permissible. So that's part of the culture. So it's no wonder that when all that comes to the West, there's a clash but the problem is so many Westerners, they don't realize the source of their own culture, which is really Judeo-Christian mores. And even if you're not a follower of religion and you're a secular person, it still impacts your mind, your epistemology. It's completely formed you, even though you don't know it. You could be a flaming atheist, but you don't understand that the underpinnings of your beliefs are actually Judeo-Christian and come from the Bible. Right. And that's the problem. People think that they don't, and they're just applicable, and everyone shares in these beliefs. All you have to do is create the right circumstances. So if Muslims are acting this way, it's because they have grievances, or there's economic difficulties, or is there a lack of education? We get all these excuses, but that's really not it. That's not the heart of it. So I think that's one of the reasons, but there's so many others that we can talk about as to why the West is essentially committing suicide, and not just vis-a-vis Islam and violence, but just so many other things that are cancerous and yet are not promoted as wonderful things.
That's right. And as far as Islamic nations being poor, that's completely ridiculous. I mean, we're talking about nations that control, I think it's probably about 30% of the surface of the planet, all the way from the Atlantic seaboard to the Pacific, all the way from the Arctic to South Africa. We're oil-rich, resource-rich, human-rich lands. I mean, it has to do with their culture and their system that has created this. And if they wake up and realize that, maybe they can make the changes that they've got to make. Islam has patented terror going back to the cult of the assassins. And they know that terror works because of people will surrender in the face of atrocity. That's why I think that's why the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem eventually failed, because early on there was a group of young women and children and among the Franks who went down to the Jordan River to celebrate, and they were massacred by Saracens, and they allowed a few people to go back to talk about it, and it created terror in Jerusalem to the point where people started to build walls and they didn't come out, and that was the beginning of the end. That could happen as a warning to the state of Israel if they're not careful. I mean, there was a terror incident in Israel during Purim in Tel Aviv. This was in, I think, 2003, where children were horribly murdered. It was a despicable, awful terror incident. And after that, the Israeli people don't tend to go to these things anymore. They'll have the Purim party at home. So there's a certain withdrawal in the face of atrocity that eventually leads to loss. And I think we need to it's a forewarning for freedom-loving nations to not succumb to those sorts of tactics. They have to be met on the field of battle without any apologies, just like Godfrey did, just like these other people did. They didn't make excuses. They understood the nature of the enemy, and they went in and they crushed the enemy and made their country safe for a generation after doing so.
Yeah, and that's precisely the reason I wanted to write this book, Defenders of the West, because I wanted to show people, whether they're religious or not, whether they're Christians or not, that that before, in this so-called barbaric pre-modern times, at least those men understood what they were facing. They cared about their culture, their religion, their families, their faith, and they fought for it. They didn't equivocate. They didn't make excuses. They didn't put their heads in the sand and pretend it's not happening, all being hallmarks of what we do today here in the West, especially. And they just took it upon themselves to just stand defiantly and fight for what they believe was their right. And it's interesting because even Muslims who suffered at the hands of these 8 men in the book actually respect them grudgingly, because they appreciate them. I mean, what Muslims don't respect us, the more you flatter and acquiesce and give in, the more they just have contempt for you, rightfully so. But when you stand up for yourself, and in a very bold and heroic manner, the way these men did, they actually begrudgingly respect them.
Oh yeah, no, that's why they respect the state of Israel. Yeah. Israel, if they strike Israel has they don't apologize to anybody. They'll strike right back, and they'll find the source of those who did it, and they'll stop them. They don't make excuses.
Who do Muslims terrorize the most? It's precisely those people in those nations who are the most giving and the most welcoming. In Western European nations, whether it's Sweden and Germany, France, Britain, that's where you see it. You don't see it happening as much, of course, as you say, in Israel, in Russia, places that are pretty that are adamant about protecting themselves and not playing games.
That's right, and that's how you preserve the peace, by protecting, peace through strength. I mean, that's what Reagan said. You protect the rights of your own people and their sovereignty and their property against foreign invaders, and it's just that simple. So, Raymond, let my listeners and viewers know where they can get your excellent book.
Thanks, Charles. You can get it from any bookstore or online or so forth. Probably the easiest is Amazon. I think they even I saw a discount on it. And I want to say, as much as I'm proud of what I wrote, one of the best factors of this book is it's got 16 pages full color. Yes.
Okay. Oh, it's excellent, and it's an exciting book to read. We're talking about. I mean, this is the kind of thing they should make Game of Thrones out of this stuff.
I always say, when I read these stories and as I write them, the saying that truth is stranger than fiction. To me, truth is more powerful and passionate and dramatic than fiction.
Oh, these are incredible characters, colorful characters involved who lived amazing lives. I mean, your book should be serialized by Netflix. It would be huge. Of course, they won't do that because
of I think ultimately because it's pro-Western and the Christian element. They're going to have to get, they'll have to get that out of the way because that's not a Hollywood theme. And of course, the Islam thing. You don't want to show Muslims as the bad guys. So yeah.
All right. So Raymond, I want to thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, sir.
Thanks very much, Charles.